Think you know Ford? Well, get ready because today we rebusting 101 myths about one of America's most iconic car brands. Myth number 1. The Ford Mustang was the first muscle car. In fact, it was a pony car and came after models like the Pontiac GTO. Myth number 2. The Ford F-150 has always been the best-selling truck. In fact, it only took the sales crown starting in the late 1970s. Myth number 3. Henry Ford invented the automobile. In fact, he perfected mass production, but cars existed decades earlier. Myth number 4. The Model T was only available in black. In fact, early versions came in green, red, and blue before black became standard. Myth number 5. Ford owns Ferrari. In fact, Ford tried to buy Ferrari in the 1960s, but was rejected, leading to Le Mans rivalry. Myth number 6. The Ford GT40 was built entirely in America. In fact, it was engineered with significant help from the UK. Myth number 7. The Mustang always had a V8 engine. In fact, the base model started with a straight 6. Myth number 8. The Ford Pinto instantly exploded in every crash. In fact, only certain rear-end collisions caused issues. Myth number 9. Ford created the first electric car. In fact, companies like Baker Electric had EVs before Ford. Myth number 10. The F-150 Raptor was just a trim package. In fact, it was a purpose-built performance off-road truck. Myth number 11. Henry Ford supported all innovations. In fact, he resisted new tech like hydraulic brakes for years. Myth number 12. All Mustangs were built in Detroit. In fact, many were made in other plants like Flat Rock and even Mexico. Myth number 13. The Model A came right after the Model T. In fact, Ford skipped many letters before using again. Myth number 14. Ford always led the safety industry. In fact, they were late to adopt seat belts compared to Volvo. Myth number 15. The Ford Explorer was always a safe SUV. In fact, it faced rollover controversies in the 1990s. Myth number 16. Every Mustang Shelby was built by Carroll Shelby. In fact, later models were factory-built with his branding. Myth number 17. The Ford Crown Victoria was only used as police cars. In fact, it was also a popular taxi and family sedan. Myth number 18. Ford abandoned racing after Le Mans. In fact, they returned with the GT in 2016 and won again. Myth number 19. The Ford Thunderbird was always a sports car. In fact, it later became more of a luxury cruiser. Myth number 20. Ford trucks never used aluminum bodies. In fact, the F-150 switched to aluminum in 2015. Myth number 21. The Mustang was only popular in America. In fact, it sold worldwide and was assembled in countries like Germany. Myth number 22. The Ford GT was a one-time car in 2005. In fact, Ford revived it again in 2016 with a twin-turbo V6. Myth number 23. Henry Ford hated airplanes. In fact, he built the Ford Trimotor in the 1920s. Myth number 24. The Pinto was Ford's biggest failure. In fact, it sold over 3 million units despite controversy. Myth number 25. All Ford Mustangs had rear-wheel drive. In fact, some concepts explored front-wheel drive layouts. Myth number 26. The F-150 has always had V8 engines. In fact, EcoBoost V6 South now dominates sales. Myth number 27. The Ford Edsel was too expensive. In fact, its failure was more about bad marketing and timing. Myth number 28. Henry Ford treated all workers equally. In fact, he opposed unions and spied on employees. Myth number 29. Ford was the first to mass-produce cars. In fact, Oldsmobile had an assembly line before Ford perfected it. Myth number 30. The GT50 always used supercharged V8 South. In fact, the 1967 version had a naturally aspirated big block. Myth number 31. The Ford Focus was always American. In fact, it was designed in Europe before coming to the US. Myth number 32. Ford never built luxury cars. In fact, they owned Lincoln for decades. Myth number 33. The Model T was the cheapest car ever. In fact, other brands offered cheaper models. Myth number 34. All Raptors were full-size trucks. In fact, Ford made a Ranger Raptor internationally. Myth number 35. Ford has always used gasoline engines. In fact, they experimented with diesel and alternative fuels. Myth number 36. The Mustang was a complete failure. In fact, it sold well during the fuel crisis. Myth number 37. Ford never made mid-engine cars. In fact, both the GT40 and GT are mid-engined. Myth number 38. The Taurus show was just cosmetic. In fact, it had Yamaha-tuned engines with real performance. Myth number 39. The Bronco disappeared forever after 1996. In fact, it returned in 2021 as a modern SUV. Myth number 40. Henry Ford only cared about cars. In fact, he pushed for soybean plastics and farm products in manufacturing. Myth number 41. The Ford Mustang Mach-E replaced the real Mustang. In fact, it's an additional EVE model, while the coupe still exists. Myth number 42. All Ford cars were always affordable. In fact, Ford produced luxury models like the Lincoln Continental. Myth number 43. The F-150 Lightning name was always electric. In fact, it started as a high-performance gas truck in the 1990s. Myth number 44. Henry Ford was the first automaker billionaire. In fact, others like Rockefeller reached that status in other industries earlier. Myth number 45. The Ford GT was built in massive numbers. In fact, production was always limited to a few thousand units. Myth number 46. Ford cars were always rear-wheel drive. In fact, many modern sedans, like the Fusion, are front-wheel drive. Myth number 47. The Pinto's gas tank flaw was intentional. In fact, it was a design oversight compounded by cost-cutting. Myth number 48. The Mustang name always meant performance. In fact, base models often had modest four-cylinder engines. Myth number 49. Ford never collaborated with foreign companies. In fact, they worked with Mazda on many cars. Myth number 50. The Thunderbird was always a two-seater. In fact, later generations had four seats. Myth number 51. Ford stopped making convertibles in the 1970s. In fact, they reintroduced Mustang convertibles in the 1980s. Myth number 52. The Ford Explorer only had one generation. In fact, it has gone through 6 generations. Myth number 53. Henry Ford supported women's rights. In fact, his policies often limited women workers in factories. Myth number 54. The GT40 won Le Mans just once. In fact, it won for consecutive times from 1966 to 1969. Myth number 55. Ford only made cars for the US market. In fact, they sold models designed for Europe, Asia, and South America. Myth number 56. The F-Series trucks were always luxury vehicles. In fact, early models were bare-bones work trucks. Myth number 57. Ford discontinued muscle cars in the 1970s. In fact, Mustangs and Torinos still carried performance trims. Myth number 58. The Bronco was only for off-roading. In fact, many were used as daily family vehicles. Myth number 59. The Mustang Shelby GT350 always used V8 South. In fact, the 1965 GT350 had a high-revving small block, closer to a race engine. Myth number 60. Ford didn't enter the hybrid market. In fact, they launched the Escape Hybrid in 2004. Myth number 61. The Ford Model T was the first car with a steering wheel. In fact, earlier cars like the Packard already used wheels instead of tillers. Myth number 62. All Ford trucks were built in America. In fact, many were assembled in Canada, Mexico, and overseas plants. Myth number 63. The Mustang Boss 302 was just cosmetic. In fact, it was a track-ready homologation car. Myth number 64. The Ford Fusion was always gasoline only. In fact, it came in hybrid and plug-in hybrid versions. Myth number 65. Ford never experimented with rotary engines. In fact, they tested Wankel engines in the 1970s. Myth number 66. The Ford Ranger disappeared permanently after 2011. In fact, it returned to the US in 2019. Myth number 67. Henry Ford was always admired. In fact, he was criticized for anti-Semitic writings. Myth number 68. The Shelby GT500 was always street legal. In fact, some early race versions were not road legal. Myth number 69. Ford never made station wagons. In fact, they built models like the Country Squire for decades. Myth number 70. The Ford GT was always naturally aspirated. In fact, the 2017 GT used a twin-turbo V6. Myth number 71. The Mustang Mach-1 was just a decal package. In fact, it had unique performance upgrades. Myth number 72. Ford stopped making V12 engines after World War II. In fact, Lincoln produced V12s into the late 1940s. Myth number 73. The Ford Crown Victoria was the first police car. In fact, many brands were used before it. Myth number 74. The Model T was easy to drive. In fact, it had an unusual control layout compared to modern cars. Myth number 75. The F-150 Lightning EV is slow. In fact, it accelerates quicker than many sports cars. Myth number 76. Ford only built sedans and trucks. In fact, they also made tractors, buses, and military vehicles. Myth number 77. The Mustang was only named after a horse. In fact, some say it was inspired by the P-51 Mustang fighter plane. Myth number 78. All Ford GT500s had massive horsepower. In fact, early models made under 400 horsepower. Myth number 79. Ford never built three-cylinder engines. In fact, recent EcoBoost models use them. Myth number 80. Henry Ford was against alcohol. In fact, he publicly supported prohibition in the US. Myth number 81. The Ford Taurus was always boring. In fact, the show versions were performance sleepers. Myth number 82. The Mustang was never used in racing. In fact, it competed in drag racing, NASCAR, and road racing. Myth number 83. Ford trucks never had luxury interiors. In fact, modern F-150s rival luxury cars with leather and tech. Myth number 84. The Pinto was Ford's only scandal. In fact, the Explorer tire issue was another major controversy. Myth number 85. The GT40 name meant nothing. In fact, it referred to its height of 40 inches. Myth number 86. The Ford Thunderbird ended in the 1990s. In fact, it briefly returned in the early 2000s. Myth number 87. All Mustangs had manual transmissions. In fact, many sold with automatics. Myth number 88. The Ford Maverick was always a classic car. In fact, it's now also a compact pickup truck. Myth number 89. Ford only built cars for consumers. In fact, they made countless military vehicles for World War II. Myth number 90. The Mustang always had two doors. In fact, there were Mustang concepts with four doors. Myth number 91. The Ford F-150 never used hybrid tech. In fact, the 2021 model introduced a hybrid system. Myth number 92. Henry Ford was always successful. In fact, he had several failed companies before the Ford Motor Company. Myth number 93. Ford never built a supercar. In fact, the GT qualifies as a true supercar. Myth number 94. All Ford cars were mass-produced. In fact, the GT and GT40 were hand-built. Myth number 95. The Mustang Mach-E is the first Ford EV. In fact, the Ranger EV came out in the 1990s. Myth number 96. Ford never built performance SUVs. In fact, the Explorer Saint is a high-performance SUV. Myth number 97. The F-Series has always been half-ton trucks. In fact, Ford also makes Super Duty versions. Myth number 98. The Mustang name was never controversial. In fact, many fans hated its use on the Mach-E. Myth number 99. Ford has never produced inline-six engines recently. In fact, they built modern sixes in Australia. Myth number 100. The Ford GT only raced in Le Mans. In fact, it also competed in IMSA and other series. Myth number 101. Henry Ford built his empire alone. In fact, he had major help from investors like the Dodge brothers. If you enjoyed these Ford myths being busted, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with every car fan you know.